Hello there. My name is Jamie Gorman. I'm a community worker and member of Community Work Ireland, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this continuous professional development session on climate justice. In this session, we'll be looking at what climate change is, what the climate crisis is. We'll be looking at why it's an issue for community work. And in later sessions, we'll go on to look at the key policy contexts, some key concepts that are important for us to be aware of as community workers, and then looking at community work strategy and action in relation to the climate crisis and action for climate justice. So I'm going to share my screen to start us off. And as I said, this video is the first video in a series of three. And in this one, we'll look at the climate crisis and why it's an issue for community work. And my aim in these three sessions is to do three things. First of all, to support you to feel resourced as community workers, to make sense of climate issues and their relevance to your practice in the communities and with the groups that you work with. Secondly, for you to feel ready to take practical action for climate justice in your work. And thirdly, I hope that you come away feeling confident to campaign for just climate policy with like-minded practitioners. In terms of the structure, as I've said, we have three sections to this workshop, which we've broken up into three videos. So what is the climate crisis and why it's an issue for community work? Key concepts and policy context, and then community work strategy and action, finally. There's a couple of symbols that you'll find throughout the slides, which I use to signpost resources and indicate what we're doing at any point in the session. So firstly, you'll see a link symbol where I'm referring to material that you'll find in the accompanying toolkit, the toolkit produced by CWI and AIEB from climate crisis to climate justice, a guide for community workers. Secondly, then, you'll see a little book symbol where there are additional resources that I'm pointing to in the slides beyond what you'll find in the toolkit. And thirdly, you'll see a little chat symbol where I'm inviting you to pause and reflect, whether that's alone or with colleagues. And I very much encourage you and invite you to watch this video with colleagues and take time to reflect and discuss on the material collectively. I think that's definitely the way in which I think people get the most out of these sessions. So to begin with, of course, framing all of this and framing continuous professional development for community workers in Ireland are the All Ireland standards for community work. And social justice and sustainable development are one of the key values for community work as set out in the standards. So just to remind us of this framing for the session, the standards point out that it's important for community workers to promote a sustainable society that involves promoting environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable policies and practices. So this is ensuring that government policy and practice is both environmentally sustainable and also takes into account issues of justice and equality. It requires the practice of thinking globally and acting locally for the present and for the future. So these are important things to bear in mind as we begin to think about climate justice. We're thinking about how we act in our local communities for justice, but also how we act for global solidarity. We're thinking about the people that we're working with in the present. We're also thinking about future generations in the community. And thirdly, the standards reminds us that in pursuing social justice and sustainable development, community work is concerned with the redistribution of wealth, power, and resources in society. And as we'll see in relation to climate change, these issues of redistribution, issues of wealth and power and resources are central to how we respond to the climate crisis and the sorts of policies and practices that are rolled out. And finally, in relation to the standards, we seek to mitigate against the effects of climate change and ensure equal access to a good quality environment for all. So when we talk about mitigating against the effects of climate change, it means reducing harmful impacts of the crisis, and then ensuring that the solutions that get put forward to address climate change are equitable and that um, everybody in the community has equal access to those solutions and to a good quality environment. And of course, all of this, as with all human rights, is interrelated, interdependent, and intersectional. So we'll be looking in more detail at what that means as we go on. And so I'd like to propose that when we talk about doing climate justice work and taking action for climate justice in communities, we're talking about applying all of the values of community work to address the climate crisis locally and globally. And again, we'll continue to touch on this as we go through the session. So I'd invite you now to take a moment, whether you're alone or with colleagues, to pause the video and reflect on this question, this prompt. When I think of the climate crisis, I feel ... So make a list, write a short paragraph, or draw a picture, whatever makes the most sense to you. So please go ahead and pause it now. Okay, I'm assuming you've done that, and we've come back from you taking a few moments to reflect on that prompt. And when I think of the climate crisis, I think of a huge number of different things. Obviously I think about the newspaper headlines, the reports of extreme weather events, fires, floods, cyclones, hurricanes. I think about the impact that has on our food systems, on our water systems. I think about how the climate crisis relates to other crises we face, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, such as the global cost of living crisis. I think about how it relates to peace and war and insecurity, and issues such as the Ukrainian war. But I also think about how it relates to global social movements and global action, collective action for justice. So you may have some similar thoughts when you think of the climate crisis. You may also feel anxiety, and you may also feel fear and uncertainty, and I know I certainly do. And I just encourage us all to take note of those feelings when they arise, to acknowledge them, but not to turn away from them and not to distract ourselves from them, because those feelings are important, and they give us important information. And for too long, I think in society, we have ignored climate change because the reality of the crisis is enormous, and the impact of the climate crisis is enormous on our societies and our ecosystems, and that can be overwhelming. And so that has led that the turning away from that overwhelming information has often led to inaction. So in order to begin to address climate change, the crisis that it is causing, it's important to stay with those uncomfortable feelings. So I invite you now again to pause the video and reflect on this prompt. What the things that give me hope and energy to act in the face of the climate crisis include ... And again, whatever makes the most sense for you, make a list, write a short paragraph, or draw a picture, or have a discussion with colleagues if you're watching this collectively. So I'm assuming again that you've done that. I hope that you've taken a moment to reflect on what gives you hope and energy, because this is really important, that we pause and we reflect on those things that resource us and give us energy to face into these difficult issues. For me, the thing that really gives me hope as a community worker and environmental justice activist is people and communities that stand up and fight for justice in the face of what sometimes feels like huge odds. So we have two images here on the screen of people standing up and fighting for justice. The community campaign to ban fracking, which was successful in 2017. Ireland now has legislation that prevents fracking. And in the second image, we have the youth climate strikes, the march that took place in Dublin in September of 2019. Almost 10,000 young people, if I can remember correctly, on the streets of Dublin with allies from the environmental movement, the trade union movement, community organizations, youth organizations. An incredible show of democracy from young people who are very much leading the way in responding to the climate crisis. So these are some of the things that give me hope. So when we talk about the climate crisis, what are we talking about? Well, really, we're talking about the impact on ecosystems and societies of the changing climate. And that change to our climate is caused primarily by the burning of fossil fuels. And we'll look at that in more detail in just a moment. But this is driven primarily by a number of things: industrialization, industrial agriculture, global trade, and military expansion from the 19th century onwards. So to sum that up, really we're talking about the impact of capitalism and colonialism from the 19th century onwards. The digging up of large amounts of coal and oil and gas to fuel that capitalist and colonial expansion from the European military and imperial powers, Britain, France, Germany, and of course the US and Canada in later periods too. And so as a result, what we're seeing now is climate change being felt as more frequent and intense droughts, storms, heat waves, rising sea levels, melting glaciers, warming oceans. And all of this is wreaking havoc on people's lives and livelihoods. And particularly, as we'll see, the brunt of that is being faced by communities in the global south and vulnerable and marginalized communities in the global north. And all of this is overstretching planetary boundaries. And we might think of planetary boundaries as the limits of the Earth's safe operating space, which humans and human society must remain within to ensure healthy ecosystems that can maintain life on Earth, both for us and for other species. And the Stockholm Resilience Institute in Sweden has produced this really wonderful work on the planetary boundaries. They've identified 9 specific boundaries, which include climate change being caused by fossil fuels, but also ocean acidification also being caused by CO2, carbon dioxide, and other issues including air pollution, ozone levels in the atmosphere, chemical pollution. So a whole range of different planetary boundaries. I'd encourage you to take a look at their work. We'll look as well in a few moments at the work of the work of Kate Raworth and Donut Economics. And Raworth has been, again, really helpful in providing us with a framework to understand not just the planetary boundaries, but the social foundations. What are the minimum foundational levels to ensure sustainable development and social justice, equality, and human rights for human communities while remaining within planetary boundaries. But as I said, I want to offer a little bit of clarification of what fossil fuels are. And really, it's quite remarkable. We've been able to, as human communities, discover means of producing energy from within the earth. So we have a whole range of fossil fuels, which include peat, lignite coal, brown coal, and more solid coal. And these fossil fuels are produced by the rotting down of organic matter on the Earth's surface over time, and the addition of heat and pressure to solidify and condense them into more and more solid um, forms of fuel. And what we get with the combination of heat, pressure, and time is higher energy properties or calorific value for these fuels. So peat has a very low calorific value because it's being compressed, but not to a huge extent. Lignite or brown coal, greater calorific value, and then the more solid forms of coal have a higher calorific value, which means that they offer us more energy for less burning. So in terms of fossil fuels, these have been the primary source of our energy in the global north in particular since the Industrial Revolution. In Ireland, up until relatively recently, fossil fuels were our main source of energy. It has now tipped over into renewables, and just yesterday I checked. You can look at the daily calculator for how Ireland's energy or how Ireland is powered. And yesterday we were powered by 60% renewables. So there is quite a significant shift, and that's a very positive sign. But we do have a number of fossil fuel generating energy generating stations still online in the grid. One of the largest is Moneypoint, and you see Moneypoint here on the Shannon Estuary. It's a coal-fired ESB station that burns coal from a variety of international sources, including the Cerrejón coal mine in Colombia. And this is Cerrejón here. It's a really vast coal mine, which has been linked to quite widespread human rights abuses in the local community, particularly impacting on indigenous people in Colombia. And this is the hidden impact of the extractive industries, including extraction for fuel. It requires the displacing of risk onto communities, very often marginalized, vulnerable, or indigenous communities, who have to bear the brunt of the human rights abuses, the inequalities, the injustices of those of us who get the benefit of that energy from that fuel. So it's important to bear in mind this global justice aspect of addressing climate change and stopping the burning of fossil fuels. So all of this extraction of peat, oil, gas, coal, and other minerals, precious metals, and our using of them in order to fuel our industrial development has led us to what some scientists are calling the Anthropocene, which is when human beings have begun to have a noticeable impact on the geological structure of the planet. So geologists take a long time to decide anything. So I say some scientists because this is not yet the scientific consensus of the geological community, but it has been proposed and it has received quite a lot of traction amongst geologists and amongst the general public that we can now see evidence of human impact on the rock and soil structures of the planet, and that includes, the breaking down of microplastics in the soil, but also includes the levels of radioactive pollution in the in the Earth's crust due to the explosion of atomic bombs, due to nuclear disasters such as Fukushima and Chernobyl, and the emitting of that waste into the atmosphere and it's settling in the soil and rock structures of the Earth. So the Anthropocene is marks the point where human beings have begun to shape the geological structure of the Earth. And it comes from the Greek word anthropo, meaning human beings. So the climate crisis is, an enormous, all-encompassing issue, and it affects everybody around the planet, but it affects some people more than others. And this is why it is a massive issue for justice, for social justice, human rights, and equality. Menka Gudon here from the Women's Fund in Fiji points out that climate justice means tackling the root causes of the climate crisis, including unsustainable production, consumption, and trade, while making progress, towards equity and the protection and realization of human rights. And the link here is to some global South-feminist perspectives on climate justice, where you can read more about Menka's perspective and hear about a feminist analysis of climate injustice from women's movements in the global South. And the climate crisis presents us with a triple injustice. It disproportionately impacts marginalised and disadvantaged groups in Ireland and globally. And these groups have often done least to cause the crisis in terms of emissions. They haven't been the big polluters. They haven't benefited from industrial development in the way that the big empires of the global north and European powers did from the 19th century onwards. These groups are the most exposed to climate risk. They have they're most vulnerable to the hurricanes and typhoons. For example, the small island states in the Caribbean that are being pounded again and again by extreme weather events. And then thirdly, they have the least resources to respond to these risks and respond to the crisis with resilience. So they've done least to cause the problem, they're most exposed to the risk, and they have the least resources to respond. So this is the injustice that the climate crisis presents us with. And it requires, in particular, a focus on gender justice. And you may have come across Mary Robinson's Climate Justice book from a couple of years ago, and the subtitle of that book is A Man-Made Problem with a Feminist Solution. And what Mary Robinson is talking about there, when she, it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek subtitle, A Man-Made Problem, is the fact that climate change has been caused by, as I said, colonialism, capitalism, stemming from the 19th century onwards, which was very much embedded in the patriarchal worldviews of the 18th century and 19th century, the Enlightenment period, which assumed that men were the top of the food chain, and European white men were, again at the apex and had the right to dominate and control all others, including women, including people of color, and including the earth. So this is when Mary Robinson talks about a man-made problem, really she's talking about that worldview of patriarchal, imperial, capitalist dominance of other people and the earth. And the feminist solution being to dismantle that worldview and to replace it with a worldview that emphasizes interdependence, emphasizes care, emphasizes collectivity, mutuality, and also really addresses the disproportionate impacts of the climate crisis on women, on people of color, on queer and non-binary folks, and centers an intersectional analysis of the issue. So intersectionality is an important concern when we think about climate crisis, and really the climate crisis is an intersectional crisis because it it forces us to consider existing inequalities around gender, around ethnicity, around social class, and access to power and resources, and how that interacts with the realities of a changing climate and interacts with and compounds um, the um, the oncoming sort of injustices of climate change, that triple injustice. So taking an intersectional approach then to addressing the climate crisis will be hugely important. And I flagged here an academic article from Amarin Maya and some other scholars who develop a conceptual framework for intersectional climate justice. And we have here a diagram that sets out this framework. So they talk about the importance of an intersectional climate justice approach, tackling gender and race inequalities, redressing the drivers of differential vulnerability. So this is that point around recognizing that different people will experience climate vulnerability differently, and addressing that and preventing that differential vulnerability. Developing an ethics and politics of care. This is that interdependence, that mutuality. Adopting place-based and place-making approaches. So they come from an urban planning background. So this language around place-based and place-making approaches, I think can really translate into taking a community development approach, working as community workers to support the development of community resilience. And operationalizing climate action and community resilience. So this is about, driving forward ambitious and equitable climate policies that build community resilience across our food systems, our energy systems, our economic systems, to not only address the impacts of climate change, but to support more just and equitable communities and societies. So that paper, as I said, is an academic scholarly article, but is synthesizes a huge amount of information and provides us with, I think, a really helpful framework for what an intersectional approach to climate justice might look like. So another thing that I find a climate justice lens really important and useful for is helping us to spot the bullshit, because there's a huge amount of bullshit when it comes to climate policy and environmental policy. Many of us might think that on the outside, from the outside, environmentalism, environmental policy, must be a good thing. But the reality is there's a huge range of different perspectives that are competing with each other within environmental policy making. And you have everything from strong justice-focused environmental justice perspectives that center everything that we've been talking about, focus on the differential impact and the responsibility of big polluters to take action and to prevent marginalized communities from being left behind, to a green capitalist approach that thinks that that assumes that technology and the markets can address the problem, and we shouldn't have government intervention. We shouldn't have any action to address inequality or structural injustices. Now these are maybe two extremes. The reality, of course, is that in the policy making process, we have all sorts of compromises and a blend of all sorts of different ideas. But it is important to be aware that not all environmental policy is good for justice and equality and human rights, and not all environmental policy is going to be focused on sorts of concerns that we as community workers are interested in. And often it's coming from that green capitalist perspective. And so we need to be aware of that. So a climate justice lens helps us to focus on how we pay attention to and analyze climate policy. to ensure that climate policies don't negatively affect marginalized groups. For example, carbon taxation, is it a progressive tax, or is it negatively impacting on vulnerable groups and putting greater burden on them? Are the solutions that are proposed in environmental policy unaffordable to the communities and groups that we are concerned with as community workers? Is it promoting electric cars that cost 60 grand, or is the government putting in place grants and supports to ensure that solutions are available to all? Or better again, are they putting in place public transport solutions to ensure that there's adequate access to public transportation for everybody without the need to subsidize an electric car for everybody? Are we focusing on individual responsibility, and is that letting off big polluters? And this is a crucial one to pay attention to, because for a long time, environmental policy has focused on what we can do as individuals. And that's important and helpful, but it has let off the big polluters. And concepts like carbon footprint, are very helpful in helping us to think about what is our individual impact on the planet and how can we work to address that. But we need to be aware that the carbon footprint concept was developed by British Petroleum in their marketing department to try to mask the impact of BP and the big oil and gas companies and the impact they were having on the planet, and to put responsibility back onto the individual. So it was more of a sort of a smoke and mirrors trick than a meaningful tool to help us to address the crisis. And this brings us then to greenwashing, which are false solutions that mask the pollution of industry or promote alternative or promote solutions to the climate crisis that don't actually meaningfully reduce emissions in line with fair shares and justice and equity. So, for example, ideas such as geoengineering, which could be anything from carbon capture and storage, which means attempting to capture the pollution from burning fossil fuels and pump it into the ground, to ideas like putting a mirror into space to deflect some of the sun's rays and prevent some heating. And these seem like far off science fiction sorts of ideas, but in reality they are being seriously considered and promoted by interests that want to maintain the status quo in terms of burning fossil fuels. So these are important things for us to be aware of and to be critiquing and challenging as community workers, because any delay to meaningful emissions reductions will negatively impact on marginalized, disadvantaged, vulnerable communities and groups in Ireland and globally. So we really can't let this bullshit get in the way of meaningful action that's rooted in justice and equality. So we're going to pause for now, and I invite you now to reflect either with colleagues or on your own, taking a few moments to consider, how does all of this resonate with you, and how do you relate it to your own work in the communities and with the groups that you work with. And coming up next in our second video, we will look at some key policy concepts and key terms to be aware of, and the key policy landscape globally at a European level and in Ireland, and how this relates to community development. I'll stop my screen and I will pause the video here.